afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And given the subject of my questions will be for you, Ms. Jacques. So, first of all, at the risk of stating the obvious, this was unlike anything else your office had to deal with, right?
These were not ordinary events. That is accurate.
Right. And so, essentially, what your office was tasked with was a way, at first anyways, was to look for ways to use existing legislation or regulations to respond to the situation at hand, right?
Yes, we wanted to see if we had any tools in place that could be useful.
Right. And
from a financial perspective.
The need to respond arose in response to the massive amount of money that was coming in to support the convoy, right?
Well, certainly that triggered our interest as people were starting to donate via crowdfunding platforms. We were looking at that, but it was to support what was a peaceful event.
Mm-hmm. Now, we heard from Ms. Leach that the amount of donations took her by surprise. I imagine that they probably took you and your office by surprise as well, right?
Well, at the time when we found out, I suppose it was maybe surprising, but we were right in the middle of budget at the time, and when we just basically read news articles that were incoming.
Mm-hmm. Tell me if you agree, but I'd go so far as to say that the amount of people donating to the crowdfunding sites was shocking, right? Especially as it's just coming in from the news.
Well, I couldn't tell you how many people donated because you can't tell the size of the donation, so... but I mean, the amount were substantial amounts, yes.
Okay, and now essentially in trying to see what your office could do, you found that there was a gap in the legislation and that you didn't have the tools that you needed, right?
Well, as we said, we knew that in the past from our work with international association organizations that, crowdfunding platforms and some most payment service providers were not captured by the legislation.
Okay. And the legislation you're referring to is the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act?
That's right.
Okay. And now, the problem wasn't... So, okay, you said that it doesn't apply to crowdfunding sites, or it didn't, but it does apply to banks, right?
Yes, it does.
So once any money from the crowdfunding site got paid into a bank, it would then be under the purview of that legislation, right?
If it was paid to the bank, yes.
Yeah. But even then, the act still wasn't used to in response to any funds received by the banks, right?
Well, I mean, the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, applied at the time. So if information was being provided to FinTrack, I wouldn't have known about that.
Okay, but...
so it's possible that information was being shared. I do not know.
But part of the reason that act wasn't helpful, even for the funds being paid into the bank, was because this wasn't terrorist financing.
Again, I can't say that. I do not know what information was shared. FinTrack would know if any information at the time had been shared with them.
Okay, well, let's look at it from the perspective of what your office was working on. So the emergency economic measures prohibited a whole list of activity that basically amounts to providing funds to designated persons, right?
That's accurate.
And designated persons were people who were engaging in an assembly that was prohibited by the emergency regulations?
Yes, unlawful act, yes. Activities, yes.
Well, specifically under the emergency regulations to participating in a certain kind of public assembly, right?
Yes.
Okay, so, this is identifying a new category of conduct that this kind of approach is now being applied to, right? This wasn't conduct that was previously been.
I suppose we were not engaged in drafting the regulations. So we were engaged in what became the economic measures order, but not the regulations.
But then the economic order works based off of people who are identified in the regulations.
Of what is described as I think you were just saying, illegal activities. Let me see. You'd have to bring me we didn't work on those regulations. So which section were you referring to? Sorry.
So section So Section 1, I believe, of the emergency economic measures identifies a designated person, right? And that's someone who's committing something identified in Sections 2 to 5 of the regulations?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, the activity that's identified in Sections 2 to 5 is not activity that was previously captured by the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Financing Terrorism Act.
No, but I don't see the link, I must admit.
Sorry?
I'm not sure that to see the link. What is your question?
Basically, that the money freezing provisions of the economic order, to
Yes.
refer to it as that, is now being applied to a new category of people that wasn't previously captured by the Proceeds of Crime Act.
Well, I mean, all that did was to extend so under the PCML TFA, the only requirement was nothing was changing in the act other than to extend to crowdfunding platform and payment service provider the obligation to register if they were in possession of property that were owned by those designated people. So it was a very narrow application.
Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is that category of designated people, there wasn't an equivalent under the Proceeds of Crime Act.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. So then now, in terms of what your office was doing prior to the use of the Emergencies Act, I imagine it must have been rather frustrating then in terms of the lack of tools available to respond to the situation.
Well, no, not frustrating. I mean, we're trying to help, all departments, we're trying to help to find solutions.
Okay, and at that time, you guys didn't have the tools needed to stop the donations from coming in, right?
Well, it's not to stop donations. That was not the purpose. But certainly, I mean, we didn't have the tools to direct, financial service providers to review their relationship with their clients or to freeze bank accounts. And certainly, we didn't end the act, the PSM, the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act did not apply to crowdfunding platform and certain payment service providers.
I'm sure you're aware that FinTrack does not have enforcement authorities.
Right, but what my question so perhaps you can take a step back. I remember in the testimony in chief, it was identified that there were two goals to the emergency economic order.
Yes.
The one was to cut off the flow of support to the protest, and then the other was to put a deterrent pressure on protesters, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of that first goal, essentially the way that support was coming in was through donations to crowdfunding sources or cryptocurrency wallets, for example.
Yes.
Okay. And I mean, we heard from previous testimony a couple weeks ago that it basically cost thousands of dollars in fuel to get a big truck across the country. And so that was one of the things that those donations were going to, right? Fuel?
That's what I heard in the news.
Right. And food and lodgings?
Again, I have no personal knowledge, but yes, I read that.
Okay. And would you agree that essentially the people who are making these donations, they're doing that because that's their way of supporting the protest?
I would imagine.
Right. So these people couldn't go to Ottawa themselves, and this was their way of participating in something that they believed in.
I suppose so, yes.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, really what the goal here was a way to prevent Canadians from expressing their support in a protest against a policy they didn't believe in.
I don't agree with that. I mean, people can make donations and kids still make donations. The only restriction that were imposed was to support illegal activities.
Right, but yesterday, Mr. Rozovsky and today, Mr. Sabia both said that the activities were made illegal by the emergency measures. So up until that point, people were donating to support a protest.
Yes, and the measures were never, the application of the Emergencies Act was always from the date prospectively, not retrospectively.
Right, but the collective
so that it only captures a donation that is going to then a declared illegal activity.
Sure, but would you agree that the collective function of those two regulations and the regulations and the order was to take a protest, declare it illegal, and then prevent funds from coming in to support the protest?
I think the objective was to try to bring, as I've said before, to a peaceable end, a set of activities that had then been declared illegal. And the objective was to try to bring that disruption, for all the reasons we discussed earlier this morning that I won't repeat, to bring that to a peaceable and timely end. That was the objective.
I see I'm out of time, so I will just wrap up with this one point, Ms. Jacques. At the end of the day, that first goal of preventing funds from coming into the protesters, it wasn't even needed, was it? Because the TD Bank had already put a hold on the funds that were held with them, correct?
Well, at the time, we didn't know what was happening with TD Bank for sure, but it doesn't mean that because there's, let's say, actions taken in one place that money will not be funneled through other ways. I mean, money is fungible.
Right, but you are aware that and it's identified in your organization's institutional report, that the Ontario Attorney General had obtained a restraint order against any funds that were held by Ms. Leach, Mr. Guerra, or Mr. Dickner.
But that only applied in Ontario, and that's the whole point. Because money's fungible, as Isabelle says, it can flow anywhere in the country. So one provincial government taking action doesn't resolve the issue. The issue for the national government was trying to do this on a broad-based approach, because that's the way you contain a situation where money can flow anywhere, which it does all the time.
Where are you getting the basis that the restraint order only applied in Ontario? It was made by the Superior Court, was it not?
I think it was just in the province of Ontario, was my understanding. I'm not a lawyer, I may be wrong about that, but I thought it was just application in Ontario.
Okay, I am over time, so those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.